This is October 9th, 1993, and we're interviewing Peter Yarrow in Napa, California. Start.
Okay. From my perspective, the most important things that folk music was about, and the most important things that it remains about, really are not specifically understandable in terms of the music per se as a musical form. It's musically charming, interesting, personal, intimate, but what's most important about it is the sense of a certain kind of authenticity that it allows as a medium of exchange between people. And within the framework of that authentic exchange is the possibility of recognition and validation of people's feelings and points of view, their perspectives about how they feel about each other, and ultimately taking those as building blocks, how they feel about the events of the world. So that music shared in this way can be and has been an empowerment tool. That validation allows people to feel less alone, allows people to feel more connected, and to sense the power that they might have if they act on that connection. And so it's not a mystery to me that, nor is it a surprise that the greening of America that took place in the 1960s was very much connected to the music that was shared, which became the liturgy of that consciousness. And it became an active way on an ongoing basis to re-energize the kind of consciousness that was evolving. What that specifically meant is that initially people just got together, as they are now, and as they had before, but in the context of an era in which there was an enormously exciting potential for sweeping away what I consider, from my perspective now, to be really a lot of societal premises that had to be reevaluated, and that's a euphemistic way of putting it. From my perspective, the idea of what family was about, as it was shared in the Hollywood movies, the idea of what politics was about, as it was expressed in the McCarthy era, and the kind of power structures with a very powerful party systems had to be reevaluated. The way people felt about each other and treated one another, and whether it was men and women, whether it was a feeling of acknowledgement and respect, had to be reevaluated. The value system that celebrated money and power and the dynastic passing on of status had to be reevaluated. All of these areas seemed to be addressed in one way or another by the music that was being shared. And to me, that's the important thing to remember, that it was not entertainment. It never was. And most of the music, even the music that was shared and written after the success of the folk boom, seemed to come from a place other than the desire to make money and simply to entertain. And if we take each of these categories of feeling and thinking and behaving and believing, and we evaluate them one by one, we see what started and what ultimately emerged. What started was a sense that people really had no voice in their own future, that the power structures would determine that, and they had to buy into the system. But the grassroots movements really that were energized by Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement proved that ordinary people could be empowered to change the world, to usher in an era when the Civil Rights Acts that contradicted the way in which we had behaved as a nation vis-a-vis blacks in our society would be altered. And And this was astonishing. And yet you have to realize that the music that was shared in this period of time in the civil rights marches was not cosmetic. It wasn't something that people did like a parade. They sang the songs of the civil rights movement to each other to re-energize each other. And people understood that connection, that they were not talking about music that didn't have a very important function. That's nothing new. The music of the union movement was not there simply to have a good time. It was there to find the moments of connection that allowed people the resolution, the strength, the commitment despite deaths, despite in the civil rights movement, dogs and high pressure hoses and de facto lynchings. So we see that in that area, music played a very dramatic role, and all of a sudden, you had changes taking place in the country, and a music that accompanied it. And this music, by the way, did not just stay in its own domain. Ultimately, it invested the rock and roll music with enormous energy, and with the sense that it too could do more than entertain. And so when the Beatles made that crossover in their Rubber Soul album, that became the bellwether for the continuation of that kind of spirit that folk music had ushered in the 2.5 years or so that it was the predominant commercial music in our country.
And you feel that crossover in rock came really from the folk movement through osmosis somehow, or through...
Not through osmosis, through direct exposure, and contact between the Bobby Dylans and the Beatles, and that was there. And then all of a sudden, something was established that lasts until today. And some of it's idiotic and some of it's wondrous. What is wondrous is that today we know that people look to folk music and to its antecedents to give them a certain sense of belonging and cohesiveness and empowerment. And that has not gone. And that once again, with the phenomenon of unplugged music being all of a sudden the hot new commercial edge of music, we see that there is an embracing of a point of view that never went away from folk music. That when people become real with each other and intimate in their exchange, and right from the heart rather than for the dollars, that something magic occurs. And we also see that in our own time that we have an enormously important legacy that is waiting to be expressed once again. When people have the heart and have the political will to once again say, we are going to acknowledge the fact that the envelope of possibility of survival has been pushed to the absolute limit. What we're dealing with now is a time when we have to find another language of connection and cohesiveness, and it is happening. And so, what was an interesting phenomenon at one time now is clearly a strain that runs through our culture, and ready to be reawakened and become a powerful force on the landscape of determination of lifestyle and political alteration. And this is not new. It went on in our own country for a long time with the articulation of the feelings of people who saw what was wrong with the country and said, by acknowledging it, we provide a portion of the answer of alteration of that. To me, therefore, every time you get a bunch of people sitting around and singing, as you do right here in Napa Valley, you reassert the possibility of a certain kind of vulnerability, as opposed to the pulling of rank on one another, a certain acknowledgement of internal feelings that allows people another language of caring. You provide the basic tools for political change, that can be done in other ways, but certainly are asserted most profoundly with the music. You live a sense of closeness in a music that doesn't astonish you when it's done, saying you will never be able to do it. It says you can do this too. And from my perspective, what happened in the folk boom was a coincidence of the societal capacity to embrace these possibilities and a music that all of a sudden emerged. When that happens again, when society is willing and able, once again, to embrace this music, it will reemerge as a very powerful and dominant force. Otherwise, it will stay by definition. It continues in the camps and the summer camps and the churches and synagogues and the schools and in the homes. And the same song that I learned from the Weavers when I was 13 years old or 14 years old, If I Had a Hammer, will be sung many, many years after Peter, Paul, and Mary stopped singing it. So it's kind of a general fundamental view that I have of what this whole boom was about and what it can be. Again, that's kind of an encapsulated academic way of phrasing it.
You clearly thought about this and lived it, I think.
I'm sure you've been asked the
both.
question, too.
Did you find, at the beginnings, though, when you were younger, when Peter, Paul, and Mary was starting out, when you were, I don't know, another one of us striving, did you find that you've always been identified, Peter, Paul, and Mary has always been identified, I think, in the public mind, with their political beliefs and political consciousness? Did you find any resistance to putting that in the forefront of your work, as young Warner Brothers artists back in the early 60s?
The peculiar thing about the music field, as distinct from the film world, where you try and make a film in Hollywood and they'll tell you how to end the film, and they think that that's their prerogative. In music, generally, they let you alone. There's more control now than there was before. For instance, most of the major labels have a policy that you can only donate one or cut a year to some charity or movement effort that you deem appropriate. But basically, they'll let you do what you want. Now, if what you want doesn't sell, and you decide to do songs about your feelings about the decimation of what was a hope and a possibility in Nicaragua, they might, and it doesn't sell, they'll say, well, it's not working, and they'll talk to you about that. But basically, once you're in a project, you do it, and then it's accepted or rejected on its own merit. And so there was an awareness of the fact, certainly when Peter, Paul, and Mary went to Mississippi, that we would lose our, when we were at some Montgomery march, that we would lose our southern audience, and to a large degree that came about, and it has remained the same. We don't tour very much in the South, except for the certain places where we did establish a relationship at that time that sustained.
Interesting. As we get deeper into this and talk to more people and read more things that were written at the time, I am astonished, though I suspect I shouldn't be, at the degree of I've come to call it folk politics that was going on. And to a large degree, there were a lot of folks who pilloried Peter, Paul, and Mary for the type of arrangements you had and the way in which you performed the music. Did that affect you at all?
Well, I don't agree that that's the case. I look at kind of
any a lot of people loved you, but a lot of people, as you read the letters.
Well, this is my take on that. I come from an academic kind of background, and in any academic background, you get a department, for instance, at Yale that's deconstructionist in terms of its literature department. Or the experimental psychology department, of which I was a part at Cornell. They become very precious about it, very political about it. The people who really tried to define folk music and fought about what the definition of folk music was about were generally like those academics that are very trying to protect their little corner of something. They were voices that were vocal, certainly, because they would have their magazine publications that would say, this is folk music, and this is homogenized, and this is... But to me, since I basically came from a perspective in which I had taught folk music under Dr. Harold Thompson at Cornell, and I knew that long ago the idea of pure folk music was gone. It didn't exist. Folk music initially was basically music handed down by the oral tradition. That's A-U-R-A-L, hearing the songs, changed and altered by the folk process. Music that was created by a homogeneous ethnic group. With the advent of the radio, let alone television, that homogeneity really altered, and there was a cross-pollination of music. So at that point, all you could have was people who were singing an authentic recapitulation of an indigenous musical point of view, like John Hammond Jr., adopting that for their own perspective. And they were kind of, or the New Lost City Ramblers, most of whom did not come from that background, but lived it, in their music at least. And then ultimately, for many people like that, it became also a way of life. But slowly the people who actually came from that tradition began to die. I mean, there are certainly blues singers continue to live it, but Muddy Waters is gone, and so many others. And so one, as a folk singer, had a choice: either try and emulate the sounds and the style of those people and preserve that tradition, or take the richness of it, reinterpret it in terms of one's own authentic background, in this case, for Peter, Paul, and Mary, middle class, educated, and bring your taste and your heart to the feeling that it gave you, and express it. And other people, and you would stand or fall based upon the tastefulness of that expression and the authenticity of your own feelings as you brought those feelings to it. And you could sing sweetly like Judy Collins, or you could take that sweetness and capacity for sweetness out of your voice like Bobby Dylan and kind of emulate a Woody Guthrie. Or you could do, as I said, as the New Lost City Ramblers did, and actually emulate the authentic grassroots singers. Take your pick. Ultimately, what sustained, and I think most people agree, is that the public itself has its own intelligence and its own creativity, its own sensibility. And the people that had something that really had some kind of value continue to have an audience. And that will always be the case, in the sense that we do have some kind of faith in the folk. We do have a certain kind of faith in their taste. And if they like a particular song and continue to like it, then it's not a fad and it sustains. So I think those kinds of academic squabbles that went on, the kind of agony that went on when Bob Dylan plugged in or when Phil Oakes put on a gold lame suit, were appropriate to the time and understandable as a historical moment. But ultimately what we have to see is that people really cared about that music. And that's the good news. The bad news was that they spent a lot of time arguing about nonsensical stuff. The good news was that they cared deeply about it. The good news was that it really invaded their hearts and their lives and empowered them to be and to do things that before they could not do and they could not be. And once they were doing those things, they translated that into a real commitment to making their lives individually and politically much more an energized posture, so that they were participating in the process that we must take part in, from my perspective in society, of saying that we can't just stand back and say things are as they should be and I don't have to do anything. Right now we have to do a lot. And right now, therefore, folk music becomes, as it existed and in its antecedent form, more and more central to what society is about. If ever there was a time when folk music in its various forms was needed, now it is needed. Now is the time that we cannot let it stop with a Paul McCartney and doing an intimate piece and say that's unplugged. Folk music never plugged, doesn't have to unplug. All we have to do is revalidate, re-energize, and allow the kind of music that has been around for so long, waiting to once again allow people that language of hope. And it's a spiritual kind of piece of business. So forgive the Pollyannish cast to all this, but it is, from my perspective. And all you have to do is share it and see that kind of very, very unaffected joy that emerges from people and know exactly what we're talking about.
I gather your definition of folk music has a lot more to do with the function the music serves than with any particular style of presentation that is...
No, it has to do with the place from which it comes, the tastefulness with which it draws from the roots of folk music that gave the original vision and view to that music, and the way in which it's implemented in terms of people interacting and sharing.
You were involved in the Newport Foundation formed in '63, and I understand there was, from what I've read at least, an express goal to limit the city singers to a certain degree and present some more traditional singers on the stage. Can you talk a little bit about what the...
Well, my posture was that we had Peter, Paul, and Mary, and Bob Dylan, and Joan Baez drawing the crowds, and that what produced that had some validity, and that we needed a recognition of the new talent that was coming in. So I really put it to the board that wanted properly to emphasize the traditional music in that form, that we had to acknowledge the new voices. And so I said that basically the deal was this, that I would have a concert that I would book and organize called the New Folks Concert on Sunday afternoon, and that would be the acknowledgement of the new voices, who are not necessarily singing in traditional ways, like Buffy St. Marie and Jim Pliskin and Tim Hardin and Eric Anderson, and I mean, enormously important voices were first given their chance to be acknowledged in that context. And those were the two poles of what we were attempting. I mean, it's interesting because Pete Seeger, who was really one of those people, was most emphatically involved in presenting the traditional music, whereas I, as kind of the child of the ethos of Pete and the Weavers, was firmly committed to the emergence of the new singers, and it was with that premise and that design that the Kerrville Folk Festival was created, which I worked on and created with Rod Kennedy, and this is of course an offshoot of it. And there was another effort in L.A. done under the aegis of SRS, then called Songwriters Resources and Services. And for me, it's been a lifelong kind of pursuit. And to watch the people come out of Kerrville, whether they were the Lyle Lovitz or the Nancy Griffiths, some of them won, this kind of competition, but it was not for commercial music. It was for song craftspersonship and really heartfelt power of the music they were writing. To do that is to sustain the aspect of the tradition that I think is essential as an active part of society.
Did Peter, Paul, and Mary's, I guess I'll say, role change any as the boom receded in the 60s? Left politics, certainly among popular culture, got a lot crazier among some people. There was a lot more violence, civil rights movement. So many of the figures there went over into Panther-type activities, and political movement, music, for a large part of the audience, went into groups like the Doors, for instance, who were talking sort of their own abstract personal political views and feelings. Did that affect the ability of you and Peter, Paul, and Mary as a group to get the message across that you wanted to get? Did it impact the role you played at all in popular culture?
Well, no. I mean, our role diminished as music and that kind of pursuit diminished. But we stayed a steady course, and we did. We were not together for 7 years. But my role in it was as an activist organizer. And for instance, I would organize, I organized the March on Washington with Cora Weiss, but all the music that came through there was something that was brought there at my solicitation. And for many other efforts, whether it was the anti-nuke effort in 1978, the Hollywood Bowl, or whether it was Shea Stadium for the anti-war effort. At that point, the music, as I wanted to share it, was... Hi, Sky, how are you? My music was... I never identified with the revolutionary point of view, although I must say being in Chicago in Grant Park was a rather radicalizing moment. But I didn't... I don't think folk music ever really embraced, in any way, the violence. The I mean, what songs did the SDS, come out?
No.
Virtually none. You would get certain grassroots organizing songs like, gosh, what's his name? I can't. My mind is not giving me the name, but he's for Citizen Action. He's a wonderful, wonderful singer and writer. Okay, it's not coming to me. But, I mean, the most left-wing kind of commitment was it came out of the feminist political positions of someone like Holly Near. Yeah. But never embracing violence. And it just was not inherent in the spirit of the music.
When we filmed Pete Seeger, he said something which surprised me. It came out of nowhere. He said, when talking about the boom in general, all the hoopla and commercialism that was, 62 to 64, 65, he said, I hope it never happens again. The whole thing came about because the record company saw money could be made from it, one, and two, in order to make money and to market things, it's easier to give them an immediately identifiable label, and folk became that. So they could have jazz, and they could have rock, and they could have folk. And so there were the two comments. One, I hope it never happens again, and two, it was to a large part an invention of commercial interests that needed a label to sell things. Do you agree with either of those expressions?
Well, my perspective on it is this. Number one, it was a joyous, wonderful explosion of a possibility of society finding a language to confirm some of the most powerful good news messages that they could share. It was a time in which political action was fueled by internal feeling. It was a time in which discovery that tore apart some of the most insular, uncaring bastions of society. The songs allowed that reconstruction that ultimately took place. The record companies didn't have a clue as to what was happening. All they knew was that they were making money, and some of the people had the sensitivity to embrace and learn, like a person like Mo Austin from Warner Brothers Records, who would keep on a Ry Cooder and allow that music to continue. Ultimately, of course, music became a big business, but never in history that I knew was music less big business in terms of the way, the joy and the energy that was shared by the people in the record companies than in that period when folk music existed. They sensed that something special was happening. They didn't have a clue as to why it was happening. One of the negative fallout things from aspects of folk music emerging in that way is that all of a sudden people who were prominent in music were expected to be informed and be allowed to have a voice in terms of what was going on in society. And that worked for a while people were responsible and did their homework, but now when you want to hear certain performing people spout about political things. Sometimes they're responsible and wonderful, as they are under the aegis of the Hollywood Women's Political Committee, which is an amazing organization. And sometimes they're mindless. And, you know, they understand a whale, but they don't understand an institution like the ACLU. But that's like the rest of society. It's just inappropriate to necessarily think that if somebody is successful singing, that all of a sudden their voices will be coherent and about political issues. And that's one of the, you know, negative and positive fallouts of the ascendancy of folk music. But my view of what happened and why it happened is that it was a golden era, a remarkable time. The best thing that could happen in our country is music and poetry and film to allow an examination of what truly is and the presentation of alternatives and hopes and dreams, much as it did in the 1960s. And in the absence of a language to allow people to take into their hearts what we now want to be, what we want to recreate in this nation. We can change all the policy in the world, but nothing will truly change. And it is up to the artists and the folk singers, the filmmakers, to develop those languages so that people can feel it in their gut, in their hearts, and act on it. And if ever there was a time when change took place, and folk music had a prominent role, that was the 60s. And that's the way I view what happened, and what I hope will happen once again in our own time.
Do you recall ever in the early 60s or late 50s realizing that you were on the crest of something bigger than you ever thought was going to happen?
I knew it immediately.
Really?
I knew it when I was at Cornell and I was instructing in this class, because I saw people who had no interest in the things that presumably they were living, no interest in the things other than the things that they were living, like status, like father's wealth, and kind of the structures of a conservative university, being touched very powerfully by the act of singing Banks of the Ohio. And I understood immediately that the music penetrated where language could not, spoken language could not. That it wasn't a logical penetration, that it had something to do with something felt, and that there was enormous capacity for feeling, even with these people who had grown up to deny those feelings and deny that sensitivity. And I knew that society would change, or I believed it would change, and I was right, and I believed that folk music would play a prominent role in that alteration. That's why I did it.
Did you consciously look back at the Weavers, for example? That's the most prominent example, and say, you know, I've seen them make a stab at what I'd like to do, and I would like to carry on. They were squelched to a certain degree.
Well, they were destroyed by the blacklist, no question.
And I would like to carry on that. Did you have conscious role models in that sense?
No, I knew I was moved by them, but the word role model was not really in my lexicon at that point. I just knew that things that people like the Weavers had done were enormously powerful messages to me, and I saw the capacity of people in my own time to respond to messages that had been obliterated by political fascism in our country.
I know that, did you spend a lot of time personally as the village scene started burgeoning in and around the clubs there? I mean, I know that you played the bitter end, you played...
Well, no, yeah, I did. I was at the Café Wag.
Okay.
As a solo.
Was there, could you sense that sense, or did your contemporaries share the sense that you had that this was going to...
I don't really know. I don't think so. I think that they felt it, but I was very explicit in my understanding of it. I just happened to have that aha experience. And I don't think that a lot of people really, they were attracted to the feeling, but I don't think that they, to the degree that I was, were focused on the capacity of this music to unleash the kind of acknowledgement that ultimately took place. I saw this as the opposite of what society was saying in its films and on television, which I regarded as fairly mindless, and still do, at least in terms of television.
Were you surprised when you broke through the way that you did?
No,
Not a,
not at all.
why? In the wake, say not necessarily of the Weavers, but certainly in the wake of the Kingston Trio's success with Tom Dooley, which is often pegged as the start of the boom of the late 50s and late 60s, a lot of groups sprung up that sang folk songs in a popular kind of way, and of all of them, none of them lasted, except Peter, Paul, and Mary. Other than telling me it's because you were very, very good, do you have a sense of why that happened?
Well,
you don't know the names of the Journeymen or the Limelighters.
Well, I think you have to remember that when you really get into the homes of people, that it's in their lives. And Peter, Paul, and Mary were a bridge to the Bob Dylans or the John Denvers or the other kind of, or the traditional music. I mean, I know kids that grew up and heard us, and one of them's the ethnomusicologist, you know, in urban blues in America. Now, I mean, I know how these people responded to it, because I know one by one that was in their lives. It was not entertainment. And that's my validation for what the musical form is about and our participation in that arena. I think that the Kingston Trio, you know, had enormous effect, but it was kind of a feeling and a style, and then it didn't go the distance in terms of really allowing itself to penetrate. And also, it's the way we interacted with each other. There was a model. If you see it in Peter, Paul, and Mommy 2, which is our new special, you'll see that specifically you're not always looking at, you know, who's singing lead. You're looking at us to validate each other. And that is then picked up by the audience, and the audience then forms a sense of family. And if ever there was a statement that answers a lot of these questions, look at Peter, Paul, and Mommy 2. And you'll see how in microcosm people form a bond that validates everybody together and then ultimately becomes a really energizing statement. And in microcosm, there is that understanding that we're not seeing people showing off. We're seeing people really valuing each other. And when we sing, it brings out the best in us. And that always was the model. And when it's picked up by an audience, they act that way too, and individually. They're not some kind of mindless mass. And you watch those kids buy into it, and their hearts are on the line. And that is what sustains us. And that's why we're still active and alive. Because it's part of their real lives. Because it's not a matter of remembering when, it's a matter of recommitting and reconstituting a connection. This is...
Let's continue at lunch.
Let's continue at lunch.
Perhaps you tell us.
Okay.